Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, welcome. We have once again a repeat guest. I'm happy always to have friends back, and this is the case of Toby. But Toby, before we get started, are you once again prepared to engage?
I'm ready to engage, Rob. Looking forward to it.
Let's do this, because Toby Beresford is an expert on using gamification and statistical metrics in business to build the best working teams. He has appeared on Sky News as a keynote speaker and has written about gamification for .NET Magazine and others. Toby has worked with organizations large and small, including IBM, PwC, and has even gamified the United Nations to encourage the UN staff to use social media to promote the work of the UN. So, gamifying the UN, it doesn't get any broader and larger than that, I'm guessing, right?
They're a big organization, aren't they? And certainly they've enjoyed being gamified, and it's been quite an interesting journey for all of us, sort of seeing some of the fruit of that.
Absolutely. And then it's like, they are kind of all over the world. And like, what do you do after you gamify the UN,
Yeah, I know. Just wait for the checks to pour in, which of course don't pour in.
That's true. That's true. So Toby, we're gathering back because I got an advanced copy of your book a while ago. Now your book is already out there. And I think it's a nice opportunity to talk about the things that you're talking there. Recently, we also had Sylvester, you probably remember Sylvester as well. He also launched this book recently, interestingly enough, in these times of, hybridity and online and all of that. It has a lot to do with his book. But I do think your book is also very, very timely. It's the book Infinite Gamification. In the sense, well, I actually, why don't you tell us initially, let's get started with that. Like, what is the book even about?
Okay, good. So what I've tried to do is really come from my own kind of practitioner experience, where I think most of my colleagues and the other engagers in the world of gamification have been thinking and working on projects that tend to be finite gamification. So and often with a kind of a training mindset. Or onboarding. It's all about getting people through a sort of a set of hoops, allowing them to level up and eventually achieving some sort of epic win, like a badge. And whereas the sorts of gamification I've seen and been kind of involved in has less that sort of objective. It's much more been instead, how do our staff or our people, they already know how to do something. They've already been trained or they've already learnt it, but we're more concerned about how they adopt and then adopt those kind of tools and those behaviors into their daily lives and then start to perform well and do even better at it. So, and those sorts of programs where you're thinking not just about learning, but you're thinking about, how do I help people adopt things? How do I help tools? How do I help people to perform better? Then that's really where infinite gamification comes in, because it's a sort of continuous improvement. It's looking at each individual's journey each day, each week, each month, each year, and tracking that over time. So I think that's been so I've seen lots of, for example, the most obvious example, something like a sales scorecard. So most sales organizations where you've got 3 or 4 or even 20 salespeople, they will have some sort of sales scorecard which tracks the behaviors that they need to do in order to achieve good sales. And that's then reported back to them either as a score or as a entry into the President's Club or 100% Club or whatever. There's loads of different ways in which sales managers engage their sales team, but the fundamentals are the same, that they are a type of infinite gamification program that helps those sales professionals continue to improve day in, day out as they do their day job.
And talking about that, because I agree that there's many situations in which it's not a one-off or a month or even a year. It's something that you're looking at, you're thinking about something that is going to last in the future. When you create these things, how do you think about, is there some sort of updates? How do you think about, sort of the future? What happens after you create this? I mean, let's assume you create it. You even went through iterations. You went through the hoops. It's now working. It's working well. Do you think of updates? Like, how do you approach this situation? Like in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time? Like, what would the outlook look for you? Does it get old at some point?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the key, isn't it? So the key with an infinite gamification program is that it needs to evolve over time. And in the book, I go through the sort of 3 sections. There's an analysis phase, which most gamification professionals will recognize around understanding the sort of the real organization requirements behind it. A design phase where you look at the different ways to do it. But the third major phase is actually evolution. And I think there's quite a bit of sort of fresh thinking in there, because if you do come from a finite gamification background, there is a sense that, I've built the program, it works, and that's it. It's all done. And the players, if you like, are traveling through, they complete the gamification program, and that's the end of it. Whereas with an infinite gamification program, of course, the players are there and they stay there. But the behaviors that they perhaps want to track, the tools that they want to use, whether it's the workflow, the process, even their level of ability does, of course, change over time. So the program itself then has to evolve. And so I look at in the book some simple mechanisms for evolving infinite gamification programs over time. And I think that's a pretty key thing. And if I may say, I mean, one of the things that I think gamification and infinite gamification in particular can then bring back to the business community is this idea of evolving the metrics, evolving the targets, evolving the scorecards, because I just don't think at the moment most managers realize that it's even necessary, or perhaps have the right framework in which to deliver an evolving scorecard.
Absolutely. And this brings me back. I don't want to sort of go into the deep end, because we were on episode 37 with Toby. If you want to, take a look at that, you're curious about what Toby's story is, where do you start? What were some of his, tough moments, his glorious moments as well? All those things are there. And we started talking, one of the sort of the key lessons or the key things that went throughout was what we called score science. And then you even suggested we have Chuck, and we had Chuck in the show as well. I understand that and from your book as well, which I had the chance to read it, your whole theory stems from keeping good scores. So how do we keep good scores? What does that even mean?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And for me, the key is that there are good scores and bad scores. So there's or perhaps better phrase, perhaps there's well-designed scores and badly designed scores. So, and for me, an infinite gamification program is usually a score combined with some form of comparison, whether that's comparing against yourself or comparing against others, individuals, or comparing as a team. It doesn't really matter, but the two usually go hand in hand. And the thing is that if you have a well-designed score, it's going to create the positive behaviors that both the organization or the manager creating and publishing the score want, and the player wants. And so it's a win for both, if you like. So a well-designed score has that effect. Now, the problem is that a badly designed score will have unwanted side effects. It may do something that the manager wants, but not what the player wants. And you get this sense of manipulation. I've been manipulated by the score. But on the reverse, you might also have the situation where it does something that the player wants, but not what the manager wants. And so then you have this sense of the program being gamed by the players. So it's very important when anybody designs their own program that they have that kind of idea in the mind that actually they can design it well and they can design it badly. And of course, that means that if there's a chance to do something well or badly, that means everybody just has to think about it. And so what I've hoped to do in this book is really to signpost all the key questions that you need to ask yourself in order to create a well-designed program. It's by no means I'm afraid I can't do all the hard work for you, but it is a toolkit that just says a set of checklists, which actually, if you were to go through it, what you'd find is that you'd create a well-designed score would come out at the end of it, because you'd have been forced to think through all the real issues.
Absolutely. And you've touched upon something there, which is key. And we were talking before starting the interview, which is you're talking about managers and employees. And there's definitely, among many of us, there is an interest and a push that we're doing, like myself, like in everyday work and all the things that we're doing. There is some of us who are also sort of trying to push forward the fact that gamification gets sort of incorporated into business practice and to business studies as well, because we do realize that this can have a great impact, as you were saying, for example, in, the management of employees, but also in other disciplines of business. So how do you view this side of what you were mentioning? Sort of, you're talking about how scores are well kept so that both sides of the business, in this case, employees and employers, are satisfied. How do you think this will sort of break in, or hopefully break in, to the business disciplines?
Yeah, that's good. So I think particularly today, with this sort of move to remote working for so many of us, I think it really does provide a kind of a new greenfield opportunity for organizations to look at the way in which they recognize good performance, but also help individual employees to focus on the behaviors that actually kind of deliver the goods for the business. I mean, we've had I'm not a business management historian, but I mean, we've had a good long period now where we've all been sitting in offices, and the main metric that employees and managers look at is the number of hours spent, the sort of this idea of presenteeism, that the longer you are in the office, the better you must be as an employee, which of course we know is absolute rubbish. The best employees aren't necessarily the ones that spend the most time sitting at their desk.
I'm going to jump in because it couldn't be more timely, sort of a comment in that sense. Like, I'm not going to talk specifics in any capacity, but I know of many situations where exactly that sort of sitting on the chair time was being measured, and whether or not people are sitting there, it's not necessarily about results. It is powerful and it's refreshing. It's one of the few good things that we've had from this pandemic. It's the fact that many people realized that the pandemic came in, and in some businesses where this could already happen, it happened and nothing changed, and then everything is okay. So the business said, oh, so this is something we can do. And actually, we're even saving some money. So let's move forward with it. So it pushed some people. There have been bad consequences, of course. There's people whose jobs are not possible to do remotely and have had bad consequences. But, I'm trying to bring in the good side of this. So I just wanted to make that comment to make sure it's highlighted, because I do think it is a very good time to talk about this.
Yeah, of course. And yes. And I think we're all all our roles and jobs are all changing a little bit as a result. And I think there is this period of adaptation. Into that is where I think lots of managers will be now looking at scorecards and the way in which they distribute the score, the results of what's going on at work, because you have to, if somebody's sort of stuck out on a limb somewhere where in their home, that you don't have that sense of shared achievement, you don't have the sense of managerial presence, you don't have that kind of many of the sort of the traditional toolkits that tools a manager has to support his or her staff. So, offering a scorecard is something that I'm sure many managers will be trying to do. And it's usually comes from an enablement background. So if I take one of my, I spent 3 years working with IBM, with their inside sales team, who were a remote distributed team across the globe. And they were transitioning to kind of digital selling. That was the main kind of essence of what they were doing. And so what the management and the gamification program, infinite gamification program that we put in place that IBM put in place, was really about looking at all the different tools that were being given to those inside sales reps and saying, okay, let's see how you're adopting, how you're performing using these tools, and let's give you a score, some feedback each month with some limited comparison that wasn't a pure sort of leaderboard, but some limited comparison with your colleagues, so that each inside sales rep could see how they were doing on that kind of journey to being a better inside seller and a better digital seller. And it's a great example. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that program changed an enormous amount from day one to the third year of the program. So, and it comes back to this idea that if the management team are looking at the scoring program, they're looking at the feedback systems they're putting in place and saying from day one, this is going to change in 6 months, in 12 months time, because there will be different tools, there'll be different metrics, there'll be behaviors we weren't expecting. We want to kind of tune and tweak this. If they're thinking that from day one, then I think the program has a chance of succeeding, because nobody gets it right first time. You always have to kind of evolve and change it in response to sort of to user behavior.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And Toby, you know this, I'm also very much into education, and I'm going to just throw in maybe a little bit of controversy here.
Hit me, Rob.
As we know, grades are also a score that we're keeping, and there are scorecards around grades. And I have personally argued that, school and university in many ways and in many capacities in general, and I'm generalizing very broadly as well, is a poorly designed game. And I don't know if you would argue as well that it is a poorly designed scorecard in many ways. So what's your first reaction when you hear talking about, grades and the grading system and the maybe, well, I don't want to talk about certification because some of them are very valuable as well, but the grading system, what comes to your mind as a scorecard and a scorekeeper, an expert one, indeed?
Yeah. So interesting, isn't it? So, I think the first thing that's interesting is the two play together. We are conditioned through education to look at scorecards. That's the one of the reasons that scores and infinite gamification works at all in an industrial setting is because people have spent 18 years in education thinking and being told that, getting a high score is a good thing. So there is obviously that sort of that kind of link between the two. And when it comes to your point about are grades a good thing, I think my perspective on it is that everything that we've found from in the world of infinite gamification is that every context is unique. And what I mean by that is that the more that we know about an organization or even an individual, but particularly around any kind of group trying to do something, that there isn't a kind of a one size fits all infinite gamification sort of scorecard that you can just get out of the box and say, yep, this is going to work here. It just doesn't work like that, because each organization, each kind of learning journey, if you like, taking it in the education world, is going to have a slightly different skew and a slightly different bias. I'm actually doing I'm back in education myself at the moment. I'm doing a part-time theology course, which is fascinating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I thought it was going to be really dull, but it's actually really interesting. Sort of it's a whole different world from gamification. So it's quite interesting. It's good for me. But the way in which they mark us is, they do give a grade, a percentage, but the most interesting part of it is that they also break down the rubric of what goes into that grade. So you can see across the 5 sort of, as the marker has looked at it, what are the different, if you said, okay, these are the different 5 areas that she wants to mark against, you can then see the feedback per rubric point, if you like. And so that, I think that's an example for me of how this particular course is starting to sort of go beyond just the basics of a grade and start to think more about better feedback at a more granular level. Because of course, as an individual, I need the sort of the individual feedback. I don't just want to just telling me, I've got a mark out of 100 is of relatively limited use if I'm going to now optimize and improve my performance for the next essay or next paper. So I think I think coming back to your point about our grades, and I think they're a good, they're just a start, but actually I would encourage any kind of educator to think, okay, that's fine. Now reading the book, where else can I provide better feedback to my students that will help more of them succeed?
Absolutely. So just a small clarification. I don't want to mean that grades are, sort of grades should be just eliminated necessarily.
Yeah.
Well, the thing I've mentioned many times to students is, as an educator as well, I can tell you that we need to set grades, and that's fine. But there are also a series of restrictions around which those sort of gradable items need to be considered. And for example, like a simple test, the same test as we've been taking for years and decades, I'm not sure that is necessarily the best way to both, as you said, provide feedback, but also even understand what is the level of advancement. It might be one of the best proxies available. It doesn't mean it is a good proxy in any capacity. So that was, in general, that tends to be my point around grades. And I talk about this with my students who get very, very anxious about grades. They feel their whole future is depending on, the grade they'll get. And for example, I just finished my operations management course, and some students feel like it's the end of the world, whether they get, the top grade or the second or the third or the fifth or the 30th. And that is exactly my point. As you were saying, it's not just about the number that you get there, which, it has its value. I kind of understand it. There's also arguments that go back and forth in that sense. But beyond that, like your main objective, your main metric personally must not be the grade. And that's where I think there is a lot of room for intervention, as you were mentioning, both on the feedback side, which I think is positive and whenever possible is very, very important. But, teachers as well can sometimes be overwhelmed with work. Sometimes they have too many sections. Sometimes a single section is, 600 people. So how do you personalize that? Hopefully technology will start helping us with some of those things, but I'm not sure like the whole feedback is necessarily always possible. But I do agree, like when you can write, as you were saying, an essay, or one of the things I like to do with my students when we teach gamification is give them feedback on a project. So they're actually doing the thing, and that's where tying the grade to doing exactly what they're doing, I think is important. And it brings them into the industry in a way, which hopefully is what we agree on that one.
Yeah,
as well.
we do. And if we think about this idea with infinite gamification one of the models that I have in the book is about so learning, adoption, performance, and how we kind of start when we learn, and then we need metrics that help us to adopt those kind of new habits, and then we need metrics that help us to perform well at those habits. So if we were to apply the idea of infinite gamification for an educator, one of the first things I might say as a manager, and this is where it's very interesting kind of area for a business school, is to say, look, the educator, either the manager's job isn't just about helping to improve a performance, but also maybe the educator's job isn't just about teaching and learning. It's also about ensuring adoption and performing well at it. So we talk about my theology part-time theology course, so we'll just stick with that. So theology is, I'm hoping that this theology course will help me to, for want of a better word, to do better Bible studies. So I'll be able to sort of help other people to read particular bits of the Bible and understand it better. So what would be a kind of the sort of I get my grade, and that's the kind of the learning side, but actually the adoption and performing side might be that the people to whom I'm giving the Bible study to, the sort of this 4 or 5 people, might then give me some feedback on that. And that would then become part of my scorecard, which would then help me to see whether I've actually adopted all the things that I've learned in theology, and am I performing well at giving those out. And so my challenge, I suppose, to any educator is when does education stop? And can, with something like kind of an infinite gamification scorecard, there is that sort of opportunity to define not just what happens when someone finishes learning, but actually to help your students to continue to adopt and then to perform well at what they've learned.
What are those things that are being taught that are applicable then in their current or future workplace? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
So Toby, the next thing that I wanted to get into is actually something that we do. I'm not sure. I think we didn't do it on your initial episode, which is taking a random question from the audience. And hopefully it'll be very, very related as well to what we've been talking about. Okay. Right. So, here it comes. I think it could be related to almost any guest. I think it's a good question for most people. And it is, how did you get started in gamification?
Good question. So I came at gamification from the world of Facebook originally. So I was working as a social app developer for Facebook. So I was building marketing campaigns mainly that were worked on Facebook for big brands like Reckitt Benckiser, Sony PlayStation. And as part of those projects, those games, I started to see this kind of idea of gamification. I think it was at South by Southwest, it was called the game layer at the top of the world. And so I kind of saw it as the natural progression from the social layer, which is what I'd been working in for sort of 3 or 4 years with Facebook, to the game layer, where we're not just sort of seeing our friends, but we're also seeing how our friends are doing.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And since then, did you, I'm guessing that you got inspired from that experience and then got started with, of course, I mean, being from marketing, it's funny. I also was teaching quantitative methods. So a lot of numbers and statistics. So people were like, oh, I want to study marketing. This is not necessarily relevant for me. It's like, well, going from marketing, especially in digital marketing, I think you're going to be looking at quite a few numbers and statistics.
Digital marketing is almost a number of numbers. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think for me, the kind of the exciting part of gamification is you're trying to sort of see people flourish, and for individuals particularly to get better at what they're doing. So for me, the exciting thing is that we can put in place simple programs that provide good feedback, that in a sort of an engaging way that allows any individual to do better at what they're trying to do. So that's really been the kind of the thing that I've seen gamification being its benefit, is that it allows that because of the engaging design, because of the good feedback, it actually helps us to continue to get to continuously improve. It's not just about you've achieved something and that's it. It's actually, okay, this is the type of tool that's going to help me on my longer journey. And for me, that's very exciting.
Absolutely. And you touch upon, and this is the last thing that probably we're going to get into, but you touched upon something and you've mentioned it in different capacities before. I would almost call it the ethical side of gamification, which I argue is even the place where this actually starts to be effective, maybe not in the immediate run only, but also in the medium and the long term, which is, that side of, gamification is not about just benefiting one of the sides that is in that circumstance. I don't want to call it transaction because it's not a transaction only, but it's about getting people to improve on something that they actually would want to improve and maybe don't manage to do it because they don't understand how it goes, because they can't get into the habit, because they don't find the motivation, whatever that is. Whereas when it's just sort of pure manipulation and getting you to do something that you would otherwise just not do because you don't want to, that's where I think both the field, the person, and the company doing this is losing in the medium and long run. So I just wanted to bring that back and hear your reactions to sort of the ethical side of this whole thing, because I think we have kind of been going around it for a bit.
Yeah, no, I think it's critical. And the key word that I have from my experience that resolves this sort of the ethical conundrum is really about maturity. Having run really quite a lot of these programs, I've always been surprised by how immature a large number of players are when they're given a score. And in the book, I talk about this idea of player maturity, that when we receive a score, we all receive it in a slightly different way. And so somebody who's very immature, sort of a baby, will accept the score as given. So if I say, hey, Rob, your score is 34, if you were with a baby mindset, you're like, oh, my score is 34. And you don't think anything out other than that. Whereas a toddler, for example, a sort of 3 or 4 year old might reject the score out of hand and say, oh, I don't care if my score is 34. And then we have a sort of a more mature person, a teenager would then, you'd just say, well, you'd attempt to game the scorecard and say, well, how can I make my score higher with doing the minimum amount of work? But then it's when you come to sort of what I would call sort of an adult understanding, a mature understanding of the scorecard, is you'd say, okay, it's 34. So, okay, so how can I use that score to track my progress and then optimize my activity over time? It's useful to have this score, but how does it help me to get better at what I'm doing? And then it does actually go on the maturity model, because player maturity, because then we have this sort of the idea of a senior who will then challenge the score algorithm and say, well, hang on, how did you get that score 34? Where does that come from? And is it actually measuring the right things? And then finally, we have a sort of the idea of a retiree who, for many different reasons, will say, well, actually, that score is no longer relevant. I've outgrown it. And so actually, I think for me, that this idea of maturity when it comes to receiving, to being given and to accessing and using scores, and there are lots of scores in our lives, aren't there? There's whether it's a Fitbit ratio or the salary or a score that your boss has given or HR. There are lots of scores or credit score. We receive lots of scores, but actually the key issue that I'm seeing is that people aren't mature haven't matured sufficiently in the way in which they receive them. And so I'd be really excited from my book, From Infinite Gamification, if it helped both managers and players to become a little bit more mature in the way in which we see the scores that are being used on us.
Well, that sounds like a beautiful way to end this conversation. So Toby, before we go, of course, where can we find more about Toby? Where can we find Infinite Gamification? Lead us to wherever you want us, and of course, any other call to actions that you want to have. This is the time before we say game over.
Thank you, Rob. Well, guys, have a look at infiniteGamification.com. There's a link there to the book. It's on Amazon as Kindle or as a paperback. And they're also going to, every time I sort of have any kind of videos or downloads or resources, I'm going to be putting them up on that site. I've created an Instagram for Infinite Gamification. So if you like that social media, please come and follow me there. And as a takeaway, it'd be really helpful. We're really keen, I think, all of us within the gamification industry, to see gamification being kind of used in the right way, but also, used more widely. And so my hope is that this book which is targeted at kind of any type of business manager or any type of leader, this could be a tool that we could be sharing within kind of organizations that we're in and saying, look, this is how you could be using gamification with your spreadsheet about your employees or your HR program or whatever it is. But I think what we really need to do to expand the kind of the reach and the ability of gamification itself is to sort of see it being used in the right way within organizations. And my hope is that this book can contribute to that kind of vision. Absolutely.
I'm sure it will. So thank you very much, Toby. We can find Toby both on his website of infiniteGamification.com. There is an Infinite Gamification Instagram account. I know I've followed Toby for a while in Twitter as well. So you can find the links to all of these things. You can go to ProfessorGame.com. You type Toby. You'll find both of these awesome episodes with Toby. And if you're anything interested into these things about scorekeeping and scorecards and score science and infinite gamification, you'll find a lot of value in both of these episodes. So Toby, again, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for writing a book. I know it's a massive endeavor, which is not always financially recognized, but I'm sure it'll bring you, a lot of recognition from the work that you have done. So thank you very much for all of that. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
Thanks, Rob.
Hey, Engagers. Thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this, encore with Toby. And I know you always have interesting things you want to find out. There are questions that you have. So if you have questions, if there's something that you're curious about, something that would maybe be very useful for you in your life, well, go ahead, go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. It will very probably be selected in the future, and if it does, it'll come up in a future episode and you will get answered live by one of our experts. And before you go on to your next mission, do you want to know what is up, what's going on next in Professor Game Podcast? Well, then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode. See you there.